Some years ago, I was on a retreat with a group of young adults, and I was given an example of something, and I was like, do you remember the story of the lost sheep? They're like, no. What's the story of the lost? You know the story of the lost sheep and the good shepherd? No. Well, do you remember the story of the prodigal son I was telling them? They're like, no. And I was like, what? How do you not know the story of all the basic stories, the lost sheep and the good shepherd and the story of the prodigal son? You see, the mystery of the parables is parables are actually windows to heaven. They help us to see things from God's perspective in simple and some beautiful ways. And without knowing the parables, there's many things that Jesus teaches us to help us to know how God sees things. They're like windows to heaven. So more and more, the more we know the parables, first and foremost, we know the parables from themselves, but how can we not share the parables with others? If this is really how God sees things, how can we not know it for ourselves and ultimately share it with others? Now, whenever you have the parables, there's always multiple layers of the parables. On the one hand, there is an aspect for, it kind of relates, the younger son and the older son actually relates to the chosen people of Israel. Because that was their history, they kind of would have got it a little bit more than we do. I'll give you an example. According to the scripture scholars, the younger son could have literally been the northern kingdom of Israel, the tribe of Ephraim. And they were the ones who, they were faithless. They worshiped the other gods. And they got taken over by the Assyrians, and they were sent into exile when the Assyrians took them over. So they were in that miserable condition, ultimately, of the younger son. God permitted the rebellious to, when they pushed themselves away from God, God allowed them to be, again, without his favor, and led to a very miserable condition. So on the one hand, the younger son could have been the tribe of Ephraim. On the other hand, the older son could have been Judah. Judah was one, they were around the temple and they lived in Jerusalem, and they would have looked pious and looked religious externally. They were filled with pride and envy. And they too, those people were in need of conversion. But yet, look at who is present in the crowds when Jesus is telling this parable. Who needs to hear the story? Who needs to hear the story of the younger rebellious son that has a way home? And who needs to hear the story of the older son that's not so welcoming to the younger son, to his brother coming home? And who needs to hear that? We do. We do. Because we can all have a little experience of the younger son and even the older son in some aspects of our life. We need to hear the story. So what I'd like to do a little bit more specifically, I'd like you to imagine a family scrapbook, only it's the father's scrapbook. And I'm going to focus on 4 pictures. If you open the page on 4 pictures, snapshots of the story of the prodigal son. They remind us of the depths of the story. The first snapshot is this. Picture a picture and you see the turned back of the son leaving home. Parents explain to me it's kind of hard when your children move out of the house. I mean, sometimes it's not too hard when your children move out of the house at times, right? But there is the times like they're leaving home. And sometimes that's hard when a child leaves home. Only this one's a little bit more, much more dramatic and a little more biting. That story of Dad, give me my share of my inheritance, would basically could be translated as, Dad, I wish you were dead. Dad, I wish you were dead. So that turned back image of the turned back, where you just see the back of the son leaving home. I'm going to do what I want to do, and no one can tell me what to do. It was the rebellious son leaving home. What you don't see, if you were to imagine this little picture of the turned back of the son leaving, what you don't see in the picture is the heartbreak and the heartache of the father. And yet it's so crucial to the story, the heartbreak and the heartache of the father who sees his son ultimately leaving home. Second snapshot is this. If we return the page, what's the second snapshot? It would be the son with eyes downcast amidst swine. A son, this little picture, just imagine the image of the son downcast on a pig farm, amidst the swine. You see, it's interesting when Jesus tells that story very appropriately when he says, the son went to a far distant country. That's a great way to explain sin. Sin is always a far distant country, where it's just very distant from the Father. It's interesting it describes it. He said, where he squandered his inheritance on a life of dissipation. I remember being in front of kind of a children's homily, and I'm like, children, do you know what a life of dissipation is? And they're like, no. And I'm like, good, don't do it. Stay far away from a life of dissipation. But we can only glean what a life of dissipation is: a life of selfishness, debauchery, most likely excessive drinking, probably gambling. His brother brings up he spent his money on prostitutes. That could be a little glimpse into a life of dissipation. You and I know the reality of this. Sin always leaves every person empty. It leaves every person empty. We can't satisfy any kind of longing or even a need for love with material things, things of pleasure, much less illicit pleasures. They never satisfy. He thought he would be happy with no rules and no limits. Thought he'd be happy with no rules and no limits. But the things of the world left him empty. They're shallow. They never bring happiness. They leave one depraved and ultimately miserable. And that's what he was. He was utterly miserable. And so much so, if you imagine that image again, this image I'm putting before you, imagine the young son downcast on the pig farm. Now, the pig farm for a Jew is, you are not even allowed to touch swine, much less be around it. So he was serving on a Gentile farm. He basically was in the lowest of the low places. He basically hit rock bottom. And he was starving. He was like, at least the pigs even get to eat, but I'm starving to death. And that's when he gets an inspiration, even if it's an imperfect inspiration. Well, I know my father won't take me back, but maybe I can at least be one of his hired hands. And he practices a little rehearsal of like, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. Just take me back as one of your hired hands. He practices apology. Which brings us to the third snapshot. And what's in the third snapshot? A running father. A snapshot of a running father to him. A running father to me? You mean the father was waiting for me? Not only waiting, but he ran to me. Some years ago, about 20-some years ago, Phillips, Craig, and Dean did a beautiful song on that. It's called When God Ran. I don't know if you ever heard it. Kind of a little bit of a country Christian song. And it talked about the surprise of, I didn't expect him to run to me. You see, running for a Jewish man would have been, you don't run as a Jewish father. He didn't care. When he saw his son, as if he had been waiting for him all along. Some people have that, remember just kind of that image of someone's coming back from being overseas, maybe in the military, or someone you haven't seen in a while, and someone's like opened the curtain like, are they home yet? Are they home yet? Are they home yet? And that's in the case of knowing they're coming home. Imagine the father waiting. Is there a chance he'll come home today? Is there a chance he'll come back? Is that, no, it's not him. It's not him. So that song, He Ran to Him, listen to the words of He Ran to Them. He ran to me, he took me in his arms, held my head to his chest, and said, my son, come home again, lifted my face, wiped the tears from my eyes, with forgiveness in his voice. He said, son, do you know I still love you? He caught me by surprise when God ran. He caught me by surprise when God ran. And that's the whole mystery. The son didn't expect that he would receive a welcome home. He certainly didn't expect the embrace. To be reestablished as his son, we need to know the message and share it wide and far. There's always a way back home to the Father's house. And there's always a welcome embrace for those who come back. I'll repeat that. There's always a way back to the Father's house. There will always be a welcome embrace for those who come back to the Father. Which leads us to the fourth snapshot. Because after that, the celebration began. In this snapshot, I'd like you to imagine, in this snapshot, it's the father going outside to invite his older son to come in. And what does the older son do? Nope, not coming in. After what he did to you, spent all your money on prostitutes. Nope, not walking in that house, not going to that party, not going to that celebration. That snapshot of the father saying, please, you have to, nope, I'm not coming in. Who are the people in the audience? The Pharisees and the scribes. And the Pharisees had just commented an off comment, that man eats with sinners. What is he doing? This man, does he know who he's eating with? He absolutely knows. I have come not for the healthy, I have come for the sick. And he's reminding the Pharisees that they're like the older son. You too must celebrate when the sinners come home. You too must welcome them as I did. My son, you are with me always, and all I have is yours. But now we must celebrate and rejoice because your brother was dead, and now he's alive again. He was lost, and now he's found. In other words, I'm still his father. And maybe more importantly, he's still your brother. I'm still his father, and I'm your father as well. But you too must welcome him home. This idea of loving our enemies, doing good to those who hurt you, loving those who have hurt people, the sense of a hardness of heart to him. Jesus is telling him you can't have a hardness of heart, especially for those who are open to come home. You can't have hardened hearts. Doesn't matter what they did. You have to be able to welcome them home. I was reminded of the story of this past week of Rudolf Höss. He was the commandant in Auschwitz. Probably up to, he was complicit in the death of at least 3 million people. Arguably, one person complicit in the death of about 3 million people. He was awful. He was raised Catholic. He was very taken by Hitler and the promises that Hitler was bringing. Saw a lot of bad stuff in war, but kind of rose in the ranks of the SS and was ahead of Auschwitz. And it tells the story of, he was like merciless. Like, he would kill people in a snap. It wouldn't matter. He was just awful. The lowest of the low and the darkest of the dark. But there was one time where there was a series of Franciscans that were all arrested and sent to Auschwitz. And there was one of the priests, he was in the sick bay. So they rounded up everybody except for this one priest. And the priest was like, hey, what happened? They took your brother priest to Auschwitz. And so he ended up coming into Auschwitz and knocking on the door and said, they came and they arrested everyone, but I wasn't there. Can you take me in? And uncharacteristically, when Rudolf Höss heard this, he's like, get out of here, get out of here, get out of here. And he shooed him away. Well, it's interesting, when Rudolf Höss, that was so out of character for him, he was later, after World War II, he was arrested, and he was tried in the Nuremberg trials. And he had this experience of, he was sent to solitary confinement as he waited for his sentence. He was ultimately to be hung. And while he was in solitary confinement, something happened. And much likely God, who showed him the fullness and the depth of his depravity. And before he died, he asked for a priest. Now, we might not be able to understand this, but when you had family members and everybody, the dark things that he did, they asked for a priest, and priests were like, we're not going. Nope, not going. Not with what he did. Him, we're not going. And they couldn't find a priest. Shortly before he was in prison, he remembered that one priest that he sent away from Auschwitz. He said, can you find that priest? He was a Franciscan. And that Franciscan agreed to come and hear his confession. They heard, when he was hearing his confession in the other room, they heard sobs for over an hour of this man who made his confession after his many dark and depraved years. Sobs. He wrote a statement. He said, I am complicit in the death of over 3 million people. I don't deserve anything. But I'm sorry for that. And it's not just, God doesn't just get scot-free, right? Sometimes there's experience of purification in purgatory, right? There's the idea of, it's not just, okay, fine, you're fine, no big deal. It's not like that. There still is a just God. But our just God is also tempered by great mercy. Great mercy. If you know his story, it was Maximilian Kolbe, who died in Auschwitz, who prayed for that commandant's conversion. He prayed for his conversion, that before he died, he might come back to the Father's house. Now, that might be hard for us if you think of pretty extreme circumstances of someone converting nope, I'm not going to welcome that person home. And Jesus reminded us, if we ever have anyone on that list that says, nope, not going to celebrate if they come back to the Father's house. But what if they come back repentant? Nope. Or will we also say, welcome home? These are mysteries of faith. But Jesus wants to have us that kind of heart, ultimately the Father's heart. I'll never forget the story, too. When I was first here, when I was like seminary in Daniel on an assignment, my first assignment was St. Thomas More near Perrine Parkway. And I was there in my first assignment, and I used to go visit this wonderful couple. They were, one of them had health issues. They were from Liberia, which I believe is over in West Africa. And I loved going and bringing communion to them because when we got to the time of intercession, the wife would say, "Lord, thank you for the beautiful flowers. Thank you for the trees. Thank you for the sunshine." And it would go on for about like 2 or 3 minutes. And then it would be the father would go next. And he would say, "Thank you for the grass that grows so beautifully. Thank you for the moon and the stars." And it would go on and on for like 2 or 3 minutes. It was delightful. But I'll never forget that one day when after the great time of Thanksgiving, he said, and he got choked up, and he said, "And Father, please bring back my son." You see, the youngest son, I think it was a son of about 8 children, and the youngest son had got involved and hooked on drugs, I think heroin, on and off. And what was very beautiful, he told the story of how his sons, the brothers would very often go out and look for his brother. Sometimes they found him in North Carolina. He was homeless, and they'd try to get him to a shelter. Other time they found him, he was last seen in St. Louis. But you know what was very moving about it? The brothers knew of their father's love, and they went after their brother. Even though the brother didn't always want to talk to anybody, wanted to do what he wanted to do, but you could see the brothers were always going after the brother. They had the father's heart for their brother. Our brothers and sisters, we're called to have the father's heart for our brothers and sisters, including those who are the furthest away, the most hard. We're called to have the kind of father's heart. That's what Jesus desires. The story of the parable of the son, when I give you those 4 snapshots, if we were to read the scrapbook, that first picture of the back, the turned back of the son, yes, it left the father with a heartache and a heartbreak, but it moved him to love again. And that second picture, if we open the scrapbook, the second picture of the downcast man, because that's what sin does. It leaves people miserable inside. Whether it looks like on the outside doesn't matter. It leaves a person empty and miserable. And that third snapshot, if we were to turn the page, of the father running. If we only know that there's always a way home. There's always a way home and a welcome embrace about the father who runs out to meet us. And finally, may we never see the last snapshot of the father welcoming him. May the snapshot not be, "Come in and celebrate with your brother and me." May it be that he's already in the celebration, because that's what it means to have the father's heart. To celebrate even with the greatest sinners who have returned home. And that's the desire God has for us. May we have the father's heart more and more for one another when we know that they too are our brothers and sisters. And that's what it means to have the heart of the Father.